The letter arrived on a cold November morning, lost among hundreds of business proposals and charity requests on James Whitman's mahogany desk. Unlike the pristine corporate envelopes, this one was crumpled, adorned with childish drawings of stars. Inside, crayon-scrawled words spilled across lined paper. Dear Mr. Whitman, I won't live to see next Thanksgiving, but I wanted to thank you. The billionaire's hands trembled, a foreign sensation for someone who commanded boardrooms without flinching. Outside his window, autumn leaves scattered across his manicured estate, each one like the fleeting moments of a child's life he'd never considered before. Before you continue watching, take a moment to let us know where you're viewing from in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to join our growing community of storytellers. James Whitman's ascent to wealth began in the shadow of near devastating loss. At 17, he watched his mother battle a severe illness in a county hospital, where the harsh fluorescent lights illuminated the stark reality of their poverty. The memory of counting loose change for her medication would forever haunt his dreams. A local charity's intervention saved her life, but the experience carved something permanent into young James's soul, a determination that would later transform into an obsession with wealth and control. Through his college years at Yale, James worked 3 jobs while maintaining perfect grades. His classmates partied. He passed financial reports until dawn. By graduation, he had already founded his first tech startup in his dorm room. The company's success wasn't immediate. He failed twice before striking gold with a revolutionary payment processing system that caught the attention of Silicon Valley's elite. The next decade saw James build Whitman Enterprises into a global powerhouse. Each acquisition, each merger became another brick in the wall he built around himself. His mother's recovery had taught him that money meant survival, but somewhere along the way that lesson morphed into something darker. Wealth became his armor, his identity, his measure of worth. At 45, James commanded an empire worth billions from the top floor of a gleaming skyscraper in Manhattan. His office, a masterpiece of modern design, offered panoramic views of the city he'd conquered. Yet he spent most evenings alone, reviewing reports and responding to emails that could have waited until morning. The few relationships he maintained were transactional board members, business partners, the occasional charity board where his name lent prestige but required minimal involvement. His marriage had ended quietly 3 years ago, his ex-wife citing emotional unavailability in the divorce papers. James had handled it like any other business transaction, efficiently and without drama. Their prenuptial agreement had predicted the end before the beginning, and he'd given her the Hamptons house without negotiation. The media painted him as generous. In reality, he simply couldn't bear to visit a place that held memories of attempted connection. The irony wasn't lost on him. His mother's illness had driven him to ensure no one in his family would ever want for medical care again. Yet he'd built a life devoid of the very connections that had saved her. His charitable contributions were substantial but distant, handled by a team of advisors who provided quarterly reports on tax benefits and public relations impact. He never visited the hospitals he funded, never met the researchers his grants supported, never saw the faces of those his money helped. In board meetings, they called him brilliant. In the press, they called him ruthless. In private, his sister Victoria called him hollow. Perhaps they were all right. James had mastered the art of being everywhere, and nowhere simultaneously. His name on buildings, his face in magazines, his presence felt in boardrooms across continents, yet his true self remained carefully hidden behind spreadsheets and strategic plans. As autumn painted Central Park in shades of gold and crimson, visible from his office window, James Whitman had everything he'd ever thought he wanted. His net worth exceeded the GDP of small nations. His influence shaped markets. His signature could make or break 1,000-person companies. Yet each night he returned to a penthouse that felt more like a hotel suite than a home, its pristine surfaces reflecting back the emptiness he'd cultivated in his pursuit of never being powerless again. Robert Morgan had been more than just a chauffeur to the Whitman estate. For 15 years, he'd navigated not only the streets of Manhattan but also the subtle complexities of James Whitman's demanding schedule. Each morning, he'd polish the Rolls-Royce until it gleamed, taking pride in details others might overlook. His dedication earned him a reputation as the most reliable member of the household staff, though Mr. Whitman barely acknowledged his existence beyond curt directions to various destinations. Sarah Morgan would wait up for her husband each night, their modest apartment in Queens filled with the aroma of home-cooked meals kept warm. Their son Liam would often fall asleep on the couch, determined to see his father before bedtime. Robert would carry the sleeping boy to bed, his uniform still crisp, despite the long hours, whispering stories of the places he'd driven to that day. The accident happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. Robert was returning from a routine maintenance check when a drunk driver ran a red light. The Rolls-Royce, perfectly maintained as always, couldn't protect him from the impact. The police report noted that he died instantly, but that offered little comfort to Sarah and 8-year-old Liam. James Whitman sent flowers and a standard compensation package through his legal department, then promptly replaced both the car and the chauffeur. Sarah found herself facing a mountain of bills with only her part-time teaching salary to rely on. The compensation barely covered the funeral expenses, and their health insurance lapsed shortly after. When Liam began showing symptoms of fatigue and unexplained bruising 6 months later, Sarah had to make impossible choices between medical tests and rent payments. The diagnosis, an aggressive form of leukemia, came like a second death sentence to the family. Sarah sold everything of value, including her wedding ring, to pay for the initial treatments. She took on extra tutoring jobs, teaching English to immigrants in the evenings while her sister watched Liam. The hospital bills accumulated faster than her ability to pay them, each one a paper reminder of their desperate situation. Yet through it all, Liam remained their family's light. Even on his worst days, when the chemotherapy left him pale and weak, he'd draw pictures for the other children in the pediatric ward. He kept a special sketchbook filled with drawings of the places his father had described to him: gleaming skyscrapers, Central Park in autumn, the Grand Plaza where the Whitman building stood. His father's stories lived on through his artistic hands. Sarah would sometimes stand outside the Whitman Tower during her lunch break, looking up at the imposing structure where her husband had spent so many hours waiting. She never blamed James Whitman directly for their situation. Life was unfair, and she understood that, but the stark contrast between their worlds became more apparent with each medical bill she couldn't pay, each treatment option she had to decline. When the hospital informed her about an anonymous donor who had recently provided funding for pediatric cancer research and treatment, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. The program would cover most of Liam's medical expenses, though they never learned the benefactor's identity. What they didn't know was that the donation was just another line item in Whitman Enterprises' quarterly charitable giving report, approved without a second glance by James himself. At 11 years old, Liam Morgan possessed a wisdom that made the hospital staff forget his age. Despite the aggressive treatments that left him physically depleted, his brown eyes retained a spark of curiosity and warmth that transformed the sterile pediatric oncology ward. His hospital room, unlike the others, burst with color drawings taped to every available surface, each one telling a story of hope rather than illness. Every morning, before the nurses began their rounds, Liam would position himself by the window, sketchbook in hand, capturing the sunrise in vibrant crayon strokes. The other children called this his magic hour. When he'd share stories about his father's adventures as a chauffeur, embellishing them with imaginative details that made even the most mundane drives sound like grand expeditions. These storytelling sessions became a beloved ritual for the young patients who would gather around his bed whenever their treatments allowed. The hospital staff marveled at his resilience. While other children retreated into themselves during difficult procedures, Liam would engage his doctors in detailed discussions about their day, genuinely interested in their lives beyond the hospital walls. Dr. Thompson often found herself lingering in his room longer than necessary, drawn into conversations about everything from space exploration to the perfect recipe for chocolate chip cookies, his mother's specialty, though he couldn't eat them anymore. His influence extended beyond mere pleasantries. When 5-year-old Emma refused her chemotherapy, it was Liam who convinced her by turning the IV stand into a warrior's staff complete with decorations they crafted together during art therapy. And for 7-year-old Marcus, who wouldn't speak after losing his hair, Liam organized a bold yet beautiful parade through the ward, leading the charge with handmade superhero capes for all participants. The nurses discovered that scheduling difficult procedures around Liam's presence made them more manageable for other patients. His room became an unofficial sanctuary where children could find comfort after tough days. He kept a special drawer filled with his emergency art supplies, crayons, paper, and stickers donated by various staff members ready to distribute to anyone needing a creative escape from their medical reality. Yet behind his generous spirit lay his own private struggles. Late at night, when the ward grew quiet, Liam would carefully open his father's worn leather wallet, the only personal item recovered from the accident. Inside, he kept a meticulous list of everyone who showed him kindness: the janitor who always remembered his name, the cafeteria worker who saved him extra Jell-O, the anonymous donor whose generosity allowed him to continue treatment when his mother's resources ran dry. His greatest project, kept secret from everyone except his mother, was a detailed drawing of the perfect Thanksgiving dinner. Each evening, he would add small details: the steam rising from the turkey, the pattern on the tablecloth, the faces of guests he imagined sharing the meal. Though he never complained, Sarah knew this represented everything he feared he might never experience again: family gatherings, holiday celebrations, normal moments that cancer had stolen from their lives. Despite it all, Liam transformed his hospital wing into a place where hope flourished. The children's ward, once a place parents dreaded visiting, became known as Liam's Gallery, where artwork and laughter provided a counterpoint to the beeping of medical equipment. Even on his worst days, when the pain seemed unbearable, he would insist on completing at least one drawing, saying that every picture was a promise to tomorrow. Dr. Emily Thompson's reputation at Manhattan Memorial Hospital extended far beyond her exceptional medical skills. At 38, she'd become the youngest head of pediatric oncology in the hospital's history. Yet it was her unwavering compassion that truly set her apart. Her office walls, adorned with children's artwork, told the story of countless battles fought, some won, others lost, but all faced with unwavering dedication. Michael Anderson, known to his young patients as Nurse Mike, brought 20 years of pediatric nursing experience and an arsenal of dad jokes to every shift. His massive frame, decorated with superhero-themed scrubs, contrasted with his gentle touch when changing IV lines or administering medications. He kept a secret stash of temporary tattoos in his pocket, knowing that sometimes the bravest warriors needed their battle marks. Victoria Whitman, James's younger sister and board member of Whitman Enterprises, represented everything her brother had become: ruthlessly efficient, emotionally distant, and obsessed with public image. Her opposition to James's charitable giving stemmed not from cruelty but from a deep-seated fear that their family's carefully constructed facade of control might crumble if they allowed themselves to feel too deeply. She managed the company's PR department with military precision, ensuring every donation maximized publicity while minimizing personal involvement. The hospital's administrative staff watched the daily drama unfold from their unique vantage points. Patricia Reynolds, the head nurse who'd served the pediatric ward for 3 decades, maintained the delicate balance between hospital protocols and human necessity. She'd bend rules when compassion demanded it, like allowing Liam's art sessions to run past visiting hours or turning a blind eye to the unofficial support group that formed in the ward's family room. Dr. Marcus Chen, the hospital's chief of medicine, found himself increasingly caught between Victoria Whitman's rigid demands for accountability and Dr. Thompson's passionate advocacy for patient care beyond basic treatment. His position on the hospital board made him acutely aware of the political dynamics surrounding their largest donor, yet his medical ethics compelled him to support initiatives that prioritized patient well-being over financial considerations. The janitorial staff, led by the ever-cheerful Samuel Washington, played their own crucial role in the ward's ecosystem. Sam had worked the night shift for 15 years, learning which rooms needed extra attention not just for cleanliness, but for the comfort of their occupants. He'd developed an uncanny ability to appear with fresh linens just when needed, or to quietly clean up after difficult treatments without drawing attention to a child's dignity. These individuals, each carrying their own stories and burdens, formed an intricate support system that extended far beyond medical care. They witnessed daily miracles and heartbreaks, celebrated small victories and mourned quiet defeats. Their lives intersected in the fluorescent-lit corridors, creating an unlikely family bound together by their commitment to their young patients. The tension between Victoria's corporate approach and the hospital staff's human touch created an ongoing struggle that manifested in subtle ways: budget meetings that became ethical debates, policy discussions that turned into philosophical arguments about the nature of care itself. Yet even Victoria, despite her protests, couldn't entirely resist the ward's transformative atmosphere. Hospital security cameras occasionally caught her lingering outside the children's ward late at night, watching the quiet activities of the evening shift with an expression that hinted at internal conflict. The morning sun cast long shadows across James Whitman's mahogany desk as his assistant delivered the Daily Mail. Among the crisp white envelopes and glossy corporate presentations sat a peculiar letter slightly crumpled, adorned with hand-drawn stars in blue crayon. The return address simply read Room 417, Manhattan Memorial Hospital. Under normal circumstances, such correspondence would never reach his desk. The corporate policy directed all personal letters and charitable requests through the PR department. Yet something about this envelope, perhaps its childish decorations or the slight smudge of what looked like hospital sanitizer, had prompted his usually strict assistant to make an exception. James picked up the letter, its paper thin and worn, as if it had been written and rewritten multiple times before being sent. The moment he unfolded it, a small drawing fell onto his desk, a simple sketch of what appeared to be a hospital room, but filled with colors and light that transformed the sterile space into something almost magical. Dear Mr. Whitman, my name is Liam Morgan. I'm 11 years old, and I'm writing to say thank you. The nurses told me you're the one who gave money to help kids like me get treatment. I don't know if you remember, but my dad used to drive your car. He always said you were a busy man who helped lots of people. I won't be here much longer. Dr. Thompson tries to smile when she says I'm fighting hard, but I can see in her eyes that the medicine isn't working anymore. But that's okay, because the extra time your help gave me was the best gift ever. I got to draw hundreds of pictures, make other kids smile, and help Emma not be scared of her treatments. There's something I really want to tell you in person. Mom says I shouldn't bother you because you're very important and have lots of meetings. But before I go, I want to show you my special drawing. It's not finished yet, but it's about being thankful for every extra day we get. If you can't come, that's okay too. I just wanted you to know that even though you probably helped lots of people and might not remember all of them, we remember you. Every time I see a sunset from my window or get to draw with my friends in the hospital, I think about how someone I never met gave me these moments. Thank you for making my last Thanksgiving special, even if I won't be here to celebrate it. Your friend, Liam Morgan. P.S. I used my best handwriting, but the medicine sometimes makes my hands shake. Sorry if it's messy. James read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning. His hands, usually steady in the most high-stakes negotiations, trembled slightly. The drawing on his desk seemed to demand his attention, its simple lines conveying more emotion than any corporate report he'd ever read. For the first time in years, his carefully constructed wall of professional detachment cracked. The name Morgan tugged at his memory, fragments of reports about a chauffeur's accident, standard compensation packages, paperwork handled efficiently by the legal department. But it was the child's gratitude, offered without expectation, that struck deepest. The morning sun had shifted, his schedule of meetings awaited, and somewhere in Manhattan Memorial Hospital, a young boy was counting his remaining sunsets. James reached for his phone, then stopped, remembering the countless times he'd delegated such matters to his staff. But something about this letter demanded more than delegation, it demanded presence. James Whitman stared at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, the letter still clutched in his hand. The city sprawled below him, a testament to his success, yet for the first time in years he felt uncomfortably small. His secretary's voice crackled through the intercom, reminding him of his 10 a.m. board meeting, but the thought of discussing quarterly projections suddenly seemed trivial. He pulled up his calendar on the computer screen, scanning the day's meticulously planned schedule. Every hour was accounted for meetings with investors, conference calls with international partners, a charity gala planning session. His finger hovered over the mouse, contemplating the unprecedented act of clearing his afternoon. Victoria's voice echoed in his mind from their last argument, "You can't save everyone, James. That's why we have systems in place. That's why we delegate." She'd been referring to his recent increase in hospital donations, warning him about the dangers of personal involvement. The moment you start seeing them as people instead of statistics, you lose objectivity. Memories he'd long suppressed began surfacing: his mother in her hospital bed, counting pills to make sure they'd last until the next payday. The charity worker who'd helped them navigate the Byzantine healthcare system, whose name he'd long forgotten but whose kindness had shaped his future. He'd built his empire promising himself he'd help others avoid that struggle, yet somewhere along the way, helping had become just another business transaction. His phone buzzed with messages from his executive team, questioning his unusual silence this morning. James picked up Liam's drawing again, studying the careful details. The boy had captured something he'd forgotten existed in hospital's hope. Each crayon stroke seemed to challenge the carefully constructed walls between donor and recipient, between business and humanity. Standing abruptly, he walked to his private bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. The man in the mirror looked uncertain, an expression he hadn't worn since his early days of building the company. The last time he'd visited a hospital was for a ribbon-cutting ceremony 3 years ago, a carefully orchestrated PR event where he'd spoken about community commitment while keeping a safe distance from actual patients. His sister's warnings about maintaining professional distance had always made sense. "You're not a social worker, James," she'd say. "You're a businessman who happens to fund social causes." The strategy had worked perfectly until now. Until a child's gratitude forced him to confront the human cost of his detachment. He pressed the intercom button. "Cancel my morning meetings," his secretary's startled pause spoke volumes about the unprecedented nature of this request. "And find out everything you can about Robert Morgan's accident, the chauffeur from 3 years ago." The weight of the letter in his pocket seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. Down in the street, a familiar black Rolls-Royce waited to take him to his next appointment. 3 chauffeurs had come and gone since Robert Morgan, each as professionally invisible as the last. How many other lives had he affected without noticing? How many stories had he filed away in folders without reading their endings? His phone rang, Victoria's name flashing on the screen. He let it go to voicemail, knowing she'd be furious about him missing the board meeting. For the first time in years, James Whitman was about to do something without calculating its business impact first. Manhattan Memorial Hospital loomed before James, its glass and steel facade reflecting the late morning sun. The familiar Whitman wing sign above the entrance, usually a source of pride, now felt like an accusation. Inside, the pristine lobby bore little resemblance to the county hospital of his youth, yet the antiseptic smell triggered memories he'd spent decades suppressing. At the pediatric oncology ward's reception desk, a nurse looked up with practiced patience. "I'm here to see Liam Morgan," James announced, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. The nurse's expression shifted subtly, a change that sent a chill through him before she could speak. "Mr. Morgan passed away early this morning," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of too many similar announcements. The world seemed to tilt beneath James's feet. He gripped the desk edge, his knuckles turning white. But the letter he stammered, pulling the crumpled paper from his pocket. "I just received it this morning." The nurse glanced at the date written 3 days ago. "He was asking about the mail yesterday," she said. "He wanted to know if you'd received it." Dr. Emily Thompson appeared then, her white coat wrinkled from what had clearly been a long night. Recognition flickered across her face. She'd seen him at fundraising events, but never on the ward itself. "Mr. Whitman," she said, her professional demeanor tinged with something harder to read. "Would you like to step into my office?" The doctor's office was small, cramped with medical texts and children's artwork. James sat stiffly, the leather of his handmade shoes creaking against the linoleum floor. "Doctor." Thompson didn't sit behind her desk, but instead took the chair next to him, a gesture that made him inexplicably uncomfortable. "Liam fought incredibly hard," she began, her voice gentle but direct. "He was determined to stay until Thanksgiving. He wanted," she paused, collecting herself. "He had this drawing he was working on. He insisted on finishing it before." Her voice trailed off, and she reached for a folder on her desk. Through the office window, James could see children in the playroom across the hall. Some were attached to IV poles, others wore protective masks, but their laughter penetrated the glass. A little girl was showing off her bald head, decorated with temporary tattoos, the kind of scene Liam had captured in his drawings. "His mother is still here," Dr. Thompson continued, watching James carefully. "She's been with him since midnight. Would you like to speak with her?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. James realized he'd never spoken to Sarah Morgan after her husband's death. Everything had been handled through intermediaries. A group of nurses gathered at the station nearby, their hushed conversations and occasional glances making it clear who they were discussing. One of them, his name tag read Mike, stood protectively near a door that must lead to Liam's room. The same room where, just hours ago, a young boy had been waiting for a response to his letter. "Mr. Whitman," Dr. Thompson's voice pulled him back. "There's something else. Liam left something for you. He was very specific about it being delivered personally." She held out a large manila envelope, his name written in familiar crayon letters. The envelope felt heavy with more than just paper. Through its thickness, James could feel what seemed to be a sketchbook. The same sketchbook, he realized, that had produced the drawing, now burning a hole in his pocket. With trembling hands, James opened the manila envelope in Dr. Thompson's office. Inside, he found a well-worn sketchbook, its pages soft from constant use. A post-it note on the cover read simply, "For Mr. Whitman, the story I wanted to tell you." The doctor quietly excused herself, leaving him alone with Liam's final gift. The first pages contained typical children's drawings, superheroes, animals, and fantastic creatures. But as he turned each page, James noticed a progression. The artwork became more sophisticated, more purposeful. There were sketches of hospital staff, Nurse Mike doing his famous dance moves, Dr. Thompson checking charts, the janitor Sam whistling while mopping floors. Each drawing captured not just appearances but personalities. Midway through the book, James found a detailed drawing of a Rolls-Royce, meticulously rendered in pencil. Below it, in careful handwriting, "Dad's office," as he called it. The next few pages told a story through pictures: Robert Morgan driving, waiting, polishing the car, always with a slight smile. These weren't memories, they were reconstructions drawn from stories, a child's attempt to keep his father's memory alive. Then came the hospital drawings. Unlike the stark, clinical reality, Liam had transformed the ward into a magical place. IV poles became enchanted trees, medical monitors turned into friendly robots, and fellow patients appeared as brave warriors fighting invisible dragons. Each picture was accompanied by short notes explaining the story behind it. Near the end, James found what he was looking for, the unfinished drawing mentioned in the letter. It took up 2 full pages, more ambitious than anything that came before it. The scene showed a massive Thanksgiving table, but not in a traditional dining room. Instead, it was set in what appeared to be the hospital ward, transformed into something extraordinary. The table stretched beyond the page's boundaries, suggesting an endless feast where everyone was welcome. Some chairs were occupied by doctors and nurses, others by patients both current and remembered. There was Robert Morgan, drawn from photographs, sitting proudly near the head of the table. Empty chairs waited invitingly, including one marked with a small note for Mr. Whitman, if he comes. The drawing was mostly complete, but sections remained unfinished, like promises left unfulfilled. The turkey at the center was just an outline waiting for details. Some faces were blank, others barely sketched. Yet even incomplete, the image conveyed something profound about gratitude, community, and the family we choose. On the final page, Liam had written a message. "Dear Mr. Whitman, every day in the hospital, I see people helping each other. Some help with medicine, some with smiles, some just by being there. Dad always said you were someone who helped people but never got to see how much it meant to them. I wanted to show you. This is what your help looks like when it turns into something real. I couldn't finish the drawing, but maybe that's okay. Maybe sometimes the best pictures are the ones we leave space in for others to help complete. Thank you for giving me time to draw all these stories. Your friend, Liam." James closed the sketchbook gently, aware that he held something more valuable than any contract he'd ever signed. Through the office window, he could see Sarah Morgan in her son's room, gathering Liam's belongings with the careful movements of someone trying to hold themselves together. Standing outside Liam's room, James watched Sarah Morgan carefully pack away her son's art supplies. The scene triggered a cascade of memories he'd buried deep beneath years of corporate success. His assistant's research about Robert Morgan's accident lay unread on his phone, but suddenly he didn't need it. The details came rushing back with crushing clarity. That rainy night 3 years ago, he'd received a call about the accident. Instead of going to the hospital, he'd delegated everything to his legal team. Handle it efficiently, he'd instructed, before returning to a business dinner. The compensation package had been generous by corporate standards, calculated to prevent any potential lawsuit while maintaining professional distance. Through the glass, he noticed a familiar leather wallet among Liam's belongings. Robert Morgan had carried it every day, pulling it out with quiet pride to show pictures of his son. James remembered glimpsing those photos during countless car rides, though he'd never really looked at them. Now, Liam's face in those worn photographs seemed to stare back at him, accusing him of his calculated indifference. The revelation hit him with physical force. He'd become the very thing he'd once despised. As a young man watching his mother suffer, he'd cursed the faceless executives who treated healthcare like a business transaction. Now, he was that executive, hiding behind lawyers and PR statements, measuring human loss in tax-deductible donations. A memory surfaced, Robert insisting on driving him to the hospital when James's mother had a health scare 5 years ago. The chauffeur had waited hours beyond his shift, refusing to leave until he knew she was stable. James had given him a bonus but never acknowledged the genuine care behind the gesture. Robert had even brought a young Liam to the hospital with homework and snacks, saying no one should wait alone. Dr. Thompson appeared beside him, holding Liam's medical file. "He asked about you often," she said quietly. "He kept a newspaper clipping about your hospital wing donation. Said his dad would have been proud to know he'd helped make it happen." The words struck James like physical blows. Robert Morgan had died in service to his empire, and his son had spent his final days thanking the man who treated that death like a line item in a quarterly report. Through the window, he watched Sarah organize Liam's drawings into neat piles. Each one represented a day of life his money had helped provide, yet he'd never once visited, never seen how his clinical charity transformed into real moments of joy and connection. The boy had turned sterile hospital rooms into galleries of hope, while James had turned human relationships into calculated transactions. His phone buzzed insistently, Victoria, probably furious about his missed meetings. But for once, corporate crises seemed trivial. In his pocket, Liam's unfinished Thanksgiving drawing felt like a weight, a reminder of all the connections he'd sacrificed in his pursuit of control and success. The true cost of his emotional detachment became devastatingly clear. He'd funded hospitals but forgotten about healing, donated to causes but ignored the humans behind them. Robert Morgan hadn't been just an employee, and Liam wasn't just a charitable case. They were threads in a tapestry of human connection he'd spent years pretending not to see. Sarah Morgan looked up as James entered the room, her hands still clutching one of Liam's drawings. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by a complex mixture of emotions. The space between them felt charged with years of unspoken words and missed connections. Mrs. Morgan, James began, his usual confident tone faltering. But before he could continue, Sarah held up her hand, her grief momentarily overshadowed by something fiercer. "You know," he waited, she said quietly, her voice steady despite her red-rimmed eyes. "Every day this week he asked if there was a reply to his letter. Even last night, when the pain was so bad he could barely speak, he asked if you'd called." Her words carried no accusation, which somehow made them cut deeper. James stood awkwardly, the corporate titan suddenly reduced to a schoolboy facing consequences. "I just received the letter this morning," he offered weakly. Sarah nodded, then turned to look out the window where Liam had spent countless hours drawing. "Robert used to come home with stories about you," she continued. "He'd tell Liam about the important meetings, the places he'd driven you, the deals you'd closed. He made you sound like some kind of superhero." She laughed softly, but the sound held no joy. "Liam drew pictures of your building, you know. Said it looked like a castle where dreams came true." She picked up a stack of drawings, spreading them across the bed. Each one showed the Whitman Tower from different angles, rendered in a child's hopeful perspective. "When he got sick, he was so excited to learn that you were the one who funded the research program. He said it was like his dad was still helping people through you." The silence that followed felt endless. James looked at the empty bed, the bare walls where artwork had hung just hours ago. "I should have been here," he finally said. "Not just today. 3 years ago, when Robert—" His voice trailed off. Sarah turned to face him fully now, her composure cracking slightly. "You want to know something strange, Mr. Whitman? Liam never blamed you for not coming after Robert died. He said you must help so many people that you can't possibly meet them all. He understood that better than I did." She reached into a drawer and pulled out a worn envelope. "Robert wrote this the week before the accident. He never mailed it." She handed it to James. "It was a thank you note for helping with my mother's medical bills that month. He was going to give it to you personally, but—" She swallowed hard. "Well, efficiency is important in your world, isn't it? The lawyers handled everything so quickly." James stared at the unopened envelope, his vision blurring. "I built all of this," he gestured vaguely toward the window, toward his tower in the distance, "to help people. Somewhere along the way, I forgot about the people part." Sarah gathered the last of Liam's belongings into a small bag. "You know what Liam said yesterday? He said he was grateful for the cancer." Her voice broke slightly. "Grateful because it helped him understand what his father always saw in you, someone who could make miracles happen. He just wished he could have shown you what those miracles looked like up close." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Liam's memorial is on Thursday. You're welcome to come, Mr. Whitman, or you can send a representative. I'm sure either way, it will be handled efficiently." The Whitman Enterprises boardroom crackled with tension as James presented his proposal. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mahogany table where Victoria Whitman sat, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against her tablet screen. The other board members shifted uncomfortably as James outlined his plan to transform the upcoming Thanksgiving charity gala. You want to do what Victoria's voice cut through the silence. Turn our annual fundraiser into some kind of memorial for a patient. Her emphasis on the word patient carried all the corporate sterility James had come to despise. Have you completely lost your mind? James spread Liam's drawings across the table, the unfinished Thanksgiving scene, the sketches of hospital life, the transformed medical ward. These aren't just drawings, he insisted. They're evidence of what our money actually does, what it could do if we approached it differently. Different Victoria stood, her Hermes scarf quivering with indignation. We have a system, James, a system that works. We donate millions annually, get excellent press coverage, and maintain appropriate professional distance. Now you want to throw that away because one child wrote you a letter. The CFO, Richard Bennett, cleared his throat. The current format generates substantial goodwill with minimal liability exposure. Changing it could create expectations we can't sustainably meet. His words were careful, measured, everything James used to value. But liability, James repeated, his voice rising. Robert Morgan died driving my car. His son spent 3 years in our hospital, drawing pictures of the building, where I sat making decisions about liability exposure, and now you're worried about expectations. Victoria moved around the table, placing a hand on her brother's shoulder. James, I know you're upset, but this is exactly why we have protocols. Once you start seeing individual stories, you lose perspective. We can't save everyone. We're not trying to save everyone, James countered, pulling away from her touch. We're trying to remember why we started saving anyone at all. He pulled out Robert Morgan's unopened thank you letter, still sealed after 3 years. We've built an empire on the premise of helping people, but we've structured it so perfectly that we never have to actually see them. The board members exchanged concerned glances. Thomas Wright, the longest-serving member, spoke up. Perhaps a compromise. We could make an additional donation in the boy's name, set up a small art therapy fund. No, James cut him off. No more arm's-length charity. This Thanksgiving, we're opening the doors. Real patients, real families, real stories. And we're going to sit with them, eat with them, listen to them. Just like in Liam's drawing. Victoria's face hardened. I'm calling for a vote. This kind of emotional decision-making threatens everything we built. She turned to the board members, all in favor of maintaining the current gala format. Hands began to rise, but James stood, gathering Liam's artwork. There won't be a vote. The gala budget comes from my personal foundation. I'm not asking for permission, I'm telling you what's going to happen. You're not thinking clearly, Victoria protested. What about the donors? The press? Our image? James paused at the door, looking back at the room full of expensive suits and carefully calculated concerns. Our image? A child spent his final hours thanking us while we worried about maintaining appropriate distance. Maybe it's time we worried less about our image and more about our impact. James spent the night in his office, surrounded by hospital financial reports and patient statistics he'd never properly read before. Each number represented a story he'd ignored, a connection he'd avoided. On his desk, Liam's sketchbook lay open to the unfinished Thanksgiving drawing, a constant reminder of opportunities lost and found. At dawn, he made his first call not to his PR team or legal advisors, but to Dr. Thompson. I need to understand how the ward actually works, he said. Not the statistics. The people, the silence on the other end, suggested she was weighing his sincerity. Finally, she agreed to give him a real tour, not the sanitized version reserved for donors. He arrived at the hospital wearing a simple button-down shirt instead of his usual suit. Nurse Mike raised an eyebrow but said nothing as Dr. Thompson led James through the morning routine. They visited children during breakfast, watched art therapy sessions, and sat in on family consultations with appropriate permissions, of course. In each room, James saw echoes of Liam's artwork. The way patients personalized their spaces, the small acts of kindness between families, the staff's gentle humor in the face of suffering, all of it had been captured in those crayon drawings. A young girl showed him her collection of superhero bandages. A teenage boy asked if he'd like to join their weekly chess tournament. During lunch, he sat in the staff break room, listening to nurses discuss supply shortages he'd never known about, despite his generous funding. Simple things, art supplies, comfortable chairs for parents doing overnight stays, better Wi-Fi for patients to connect with friends, had gotten lost in the bureaucracy of corporate giving. Sarah Morgan found him there, carrying a box of Liam's art supplies. He would have wanted these to stay in the ward, she said quietly. The gesture hit him hard, her ability to think of others even in her grief. James realized that while he'd been writing checks to help people cope with loss, she'd been showing him how it's actually done. That afternoon, he called an emergency meeting, not in the corporate boardroom but in the hospital's family room. Victoria arrived, clearly uncomfortable in the medical setting. Hospital staff filtered in, doctors, nurses, custodians, everyone who made the ward function. For the first time, James listened more than he spoke. Ideas flowed freely. The pediatric ward needed more than just medical equipment. They needed spaces for joy, for connection, for maintaining normalcy in abnormal circumstances. Every suggestion reminded him of details from Liam's drawings: the transformed IV poles, the decorated walls, the spaces where families could gather. As the sun set, James stood in Liam's empty room one last time. The wall that had held so many drawings now seemed to wait for a new purpose. He pulled out his phone and, for the first time in years, began making calls himself instead of delegating. By midnight, he had the beginnings of a plan. Not just for the Thanksgiving gala, but for a complete reimagining of how Whitman Enterprises approached charitable giving. Victoria would hate it. The board would resist. But as he looked at the final page of Liam's sketchbook, with its empty chairs waiting to be filled, he understood that some costs couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. He placed a small in memory of Liam Morgan plaque on the room's door before leaving, not a grand gesture, but a personal one. It was a first step, small but significant, like the first line in an unfinished drawing waiting to become something more. The conference room on the pediatric floor had become James's new office, where pharmaceutical reps usually pitched their latest drugs. Children's artwork now covered the walls, each piece inspiring another element of the upcoming Thanksgiving celebration. Dr. Thompson sat beside him, her patient files temporarily set aside as they mapped out an event unlike anything Whitman Enterprises had ever attempted. The children want to help decorate, she explained, showing him sketches from the morning's art therapy session. They've been inspired by Liam's drawing. Each one has their own vision of what the perfect Thanksgiving looks like. The pictures ranged from traditional family scenes to fantastical feasts where medical equipment transformed into magical serving pieces. Nurse Mike leaned against the doorframe, his massive frame somehow making the room feel more welcoming rather than crowded. We'll need to coordinate with dietary restrictions, he noted. Some kids can't eat regular food, but they should still feel part of the celebration. His years of experience showed as he listed special considerations for different patients: texture modifications, allergies, medication timing. Sarah Morgan had surprised everyone by volunteering to help. She arrived with Liam's old recipe book, filled with notes about hospital-friendly variations of traditional dishes. He spent hours adapting these, she explained, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. He wanted to make sure everyone could enjoy something, even with their restrictions. The logistics were daunting. Security protocols needed revision to accommodate families and guests. Medical staff schedules required careful coordination to ensure proper coverage while allowing maximum participation. The hospital's infrastructure wasn't designed for such an event, but James found himself energized by each challenge rather than discouraged. Victoria made her opposition known through a barrage of emails and calls, each predicting disaster from a different angle: public relations nightmares, security risks, liability issues. Her concerns weren't entirely unfounded, but they missed the point entirely. James saved each message without replying, focusing instead on the growing pile of RSVPs from patients' families. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sam, the night janitor, suggested using the hospital's rooftop garden. It's got good access to service elevators, he explained, sketching a rough layout. Plus, the kids always say it's where they feel closest to heaven. The medical staff confirmed it could work with proper precautions, and suddenly the vision began taking concrete shape. James found himself personally involved in details he would have once delegated without thought. He learned the names of patients, their stories, their hopes. Each decision was informed by actual needs rather than corporate protocols. When the budget began to strain, he didn't hesitate to reach into his personal accounts rather than the foundation's funds. The children became integral to the planning. A teenage patient with a talent for graphic design created invitation cards. Younger kids formed a decoration committee, their ideas both ambitious and touching. One small boy insisted on making paper turkeys with extra feathers, so anyone who comes can add their own thankful thought. Dr. Thompson watched James transform over these planning sessions. The corporate titan who once barely glanced at hospital reports now sat cross-legged on the playroom floor, earnestly discussing color schemes with a 7-year-old expert in butterfly drawings. She caught him once, late at night, carefully hanging a new piece of artwork in Liam's old room, now designated as a quiet space for families needing a moment of peace. The media caught wind of the plans, of course. Speculation ran wild about James Whitman's radical departure from traditional corporate philanthropy. Some praised the innovation, others questioned his judgment. Through it all, he maintained his focus on the hospital, on the faces that were becoming familiar, on the stories that were no longer just statistics. One evening, as sunset painted the rooftop garden in shades of gold, James found Sarah adding fairy lights to the pergola. "Liam would have loved this," she said softly. "He always said the best way to be thankful was to help others find reasons to give thanks too." James nodded, understanding finally that he wasn't just planning an event, he was helping complete an unfinished drawing, one small light at a time. The emergency board meeting was called on a stormy Tuesday morning, mere weeks before Thanksgiving. The atmosphere in Whitman Tower's executive boardroom crackled with tension as Victoria presented a PowerPoint detailing the unprecedented risks of James's hospital celebration plans. Board members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs as spreadsheets and liability projections flashed across the screen. "This isn't just unconventional," Victoria declared, her laser pointer circling alarming numbers in red. "It's potentially catastrophic for our corporate image. We've received calls from major shareholders expressing serious concerns." She paused, fixing James with a pointed stare. The Whitman name stands for excellence, not emotional charity projects. Richard Bennett, the CFO, cleared his throat. "The financial implications are troubling." He shuffled through reports, avoiding direct eye contact. "We're looking at insurance complications, potential health code violations, not to mention the precedent this sets for future charitable endeavors. Our legal team strongly advises against this level of direct involvement." Thomas Wright, who'd served on the board since their father's time, spoke next. "James, your father built this company on careful calculation of risk versus reward. This feels like pure risk." His voice carried the weight of decades of corporate wisdom, but James noticed how he carefully avoided mentioning Liam's name, or Robert's, or any actual person affected by their decisions. The opposition grew more vocal as the meeting progressed. Marketing executives worried about brand dilution. Risk management predicted disaster scenarios. The head of public relations presented a carefully crafted alternative, a traditional gala with increased donation amounts, maintaining dignity while showing enhanced commitment. James sat quietly through it all, Liam's sketchbook open on his lap beneath the table. As accusations of emotional decision-making and professional impropriety flew across the room, he studied the careful lines of the unfinished Thanksgiving drawing. Each empty chair seemed to challenge the very foundation of corporate philanthropy they'd built. Finally, he stood. The room fell silent. "Yesterday," he began, "I sat with a 12-year-old girl during her chemotherapy. She told me about her dream of becoming a doctor. then spent an hour vomiting while her mother held her hand. That same mother apologized to the nurses for causing trouble because she couldn't afford to replace her daughter's worn-out slippers. He opened Liam's sketchbook, displaying the drawing for all to see. This was created by the son of a man who served this company faithfully for 15 years. A man whose death we handled with perfect corporate efficiency. His voice remained steady, but the emotion behind it was unmistakable. We processed his insurance claim in record time. We issued a press release expressing appropriate regret. We replaced him within a week. Victoria started to interrupt, but James continued. Our shareholders aren't worried about risk. They're worried about reality. The reality that behind every number in our charitable giving reports is a human being. A child fighting for one more sunrise. A parent choosing between rent and medication. A family dealing with loss while we debate. Optimal PR strategies. He laid Robert Morgan's unopened thank you letter on the table. 3 years ago, I was too busy for personal correspondence, too important for individual concerns, too focused on the big picture to see the actual pictures being drawn in our hospital rooms. The board members stirred uncomfortably as James walked around the table, placing copies of Liam's artwork in front of each of them. This Thanksgiving event isn't about charity. It's about connection, about remembering why we started helping people in the first place. Richard Bennett glanced at the drawing before him, a child's view of hope in the face of suffering. His objections about financial implications suddenly seemed small. Thomas Wright found himself studying the empty chairs in the Thanksgiving scene, thinking about his own granddaughter's recent hospital stay. The event will proceed as planned, James concluded. Those who wish to distance themselves from it may do so. But understand this: from now on, Whitman Enterprises will measure its success not just in profits, but in the lives we touch, the hope we create, and the connections we build. The headlines exploded across social media like wildfire: Billionaire's Thanksgiving stunt PR move, or real change. The New York Times ran a front-page analysis questioning the implications of private wealth in public healthcare. Cable news talking heads debated whether James Whitman's hospital celebration represented a breakthrough in corporate responsibility or a dangerous precedent of billionaire influence. Sarah Morgan found herself ambushed by reporters outside her apartment, microphones thrust into her face as journalists demanded to know if she felt exploited. Her quiet dignity in responding, "My son saw the good in people," even when they couldn't see it themselves, went viral, sparking fierce debates about grief, gratitude, and the complex relationship between donors and recipients. Local news crews stationed themselves outside Manhattan Memorial, hoping to capture footage of James's daily visits. Their cameras caught him carrying art supplies, sitting with patients, and once, memorably, wearing a paper crown made by a 6-year-old cancer patient. The images contrasted sharply with his previous reputation for corporate aloofness, leading to speculation about his mental state and business judgment. Victoria appeared on several financial news programs, carefully distancing the corporation from what she termed her brother's personal project. Her polished responses about maintaining professional boundaries in charitable giving sparked a backlash from healthcare advocates, who cited the human cost of treating medicine as merely a business transaction. Opinion pieces proliferated across the media landscape. Progressive outlets praised the breaking down of barriers between wealth and need, while conservative commentators warned about the dangers of emotional decision-making in corporate governance. Medical ethics professors debated the implications of billionaires taking personal interest in hospital operations. The controversy reached its peak when an anonymous source leaked internal Whitman Enterprises emails discussing the liability implications of Robert Morgan's death. The clinical language about asset replacement and PR mitigation contrasted brutally with Liam's artwork and letters. Thank You Liam started trending, with thousands sharing stories of corporate indifference in healthcare. Dr. Thompson found herself defending the hospital's decision to allow the event. Healthcare isn't just about procedures and protocols, she told a medical journal. It's about healing, which sometimes means bringing down the walls we've built between giving and receiving help. Her words resonated with medical professionals nationwide, many of whom shared similar frustrations with the corporatization of care. James remained largely silent through the media storm, focusing instead on the practical aspects of the upcoming celebration. When finally cornered by reporters outside the hospital, his response was simple: "Sometimes we build systems so perfect that we forget why we built them in the first place. A child's drawing reminded me, if that makes me a bad businessman, so be it." The controversy took an unexpected turn when other hospital patients began sharing their artwork online. Pictures of hope drawn from hospital beds, scenes of imagined celebrations sketched during chemotherapy sessions, drawings of families reunited in health, each one emphasized the human stories behind the healthcare statistics. Social media erupted with debates about wealth responsibility. Some praised James's hands-on approach, while others argued it highlighted the problems of relying on billionaire philanthropy for essential services. Healthcare policy experts pointed to the wider implications for medical funding and accessibility. Through it all, the children in the oncology ward remained blissfully focused on their Thanksgiving plans. Their excitement provided a stark contrast to the media circus, their simple joy in creating decorations and planning celebrations cutting through the complex debates about wealth, power, and responsibility. Sarah Morgan's quiet presence in the ward served as a constant reminder of what really mattered. When a prominent news magazine offered her a substantial sum for an exclusive interview, she declined, saying simply, "Some stories aren't meant to be sold. They're meant to be lived." James found himself spending more time in the pediatric ward than his office, learning the rhythms of hospital life that Liam had captured in his drawings. Each morning brought new discoveries: the way certain children needed their stuffed animals arranged just so before procedures, how some parents paced specific patterns in the hallway while waiting for results, the small rituals that made the unbearable somehow bearable. Emma, a 7-year-old leukemia patient, became his unofficial guide to hospital culture. She explained the importance of proper pudding cup trading protocols during lunch and why the third chair by the nurses' station was the best for storytelling. Her matter-of-fact acceptance of both her condition and her role as his teacher reminded him painfully of Liam's wisdom. The teenagers in the ward initially regarded him with suspicion, their experiences having taught them to distrust adult promises. Marcus, a 15-year-old struggling with bone cancer, challenged him directly: "Why do you care now? Where were you when my mom had to choose between my meds and rent?" The question stung, but James stayed, listening to stories he'd previously only seen as statistics. Sarah Morgan's presence in the ward shifted from awkward to essential. She understood the unspoken language of parents living in hospital time, where days blurred together and hope came in small increments. Other parents sought her out, drawn to her quiet strength and ability to find meaning in the midst of loss. She never mentioned Liam directly, but his spirit lived in her gentle guidance of newly diagnosed families. Nurse Mike began including James in the small victories that marked hospital life: a successful blood draw from a difficult vein, a child keeping down food after weeks of nausea, a first step after surgery. These moments, once buried in medical charts, became real celebrations shared among patients, families, and staff. The wall outside the nurses' station filled with Polaroid photos capturing these triumphs. Dr. Thompson watched as James learned the names and stories of each patient, not just their diagnoses. He sat with Charlotte while she finished her math homework, discussed superhero movies with Alex during his treatments, and learned to play the card games that helped distract Jacob from his pain. Each interaction seemed to chip away at the corporate armor he'd worn for so long. The kitchen staff noticed him lingering during meal times, observing how different children needed different approaches to eating during treatment. He worked with them to develop a menu for the Thanksgiving celebration that could accommodate every dietary restriction while still feeling festive. The head chef caught him one evening, studying Liam's notes about hospital-friendly recipes with tears in his eyes. Even Victoria's carefully orchestrated media appearances couldn't overshadow the genuine connections forming in the ward. When a news crew attempted to film a human interest story about the upcoming celebration, the patients and families closed ranks, protecting their growing community from exploitation. James found himself moved by their fierce protection of what they were building together. The transformation was most evident in the small moments: James learning to change an IV bag under Nurse Mike's supervision, sitting through the night with parents waiting for test results, celebrating tiny victories like a successful walk to the bathroom or 3 bites of toast kept down. These weren't photo opportunities or PR moves, they were steps toward understanding the real impact of his wealth and position. One evening he found Sarah adding a new picture to Liam's old room, now a quiet space for families needing peace. It showed the ward's daily life: children in wheelchairs racing down halls, parents sharing coffee and concerns, nurses dancing to distract nervous patients. "He saw all of this," she said softly. "He saw the beauty in even the hardest days here. I think maybe he knew you would too, eventually." The rooftop garden of Manhattan Memorial transformed in the days leading up to Thanksgiving. String lights twinkled against the autumn sky, weaving between heated tents that would shelter guests from the November chill. Each decoration reflected input from the children: paper turkeys with personalized feathers, hand-painted centerpieces, and art installations that told stories of hope and healing. Emma supervised the placement of fairy lights with the authority of a seasoned event planner, insisting they form constellations matching the ones visible from her hospital room window. Marcus, between treatments, helped design a sound system that would allow bedridden patients to participate through video links, his technical expertise surprising the professional installers who'd initially dismissed him as just another sick kid. The kitchen hummed with activity as the hospital's culinary staff worked alongside renowned chefs James had recruited. They developed a menu that married traditional Thanksgiving dishes with specialized options for patients on restricted diets. Sarah Morgan worked closely with them, sharing Liam's adapted recipes and ensuring every child would have something special to anticipate. Dr. Thompson coordinated with medical staff to create rotation schedules that would allow maximum participation while maintaining essential care. Nurse Mike transformed medical protocols into party-friendly versions, figuring out how to disguise necessary equipment as festive decorations. IV poles became magical light stands, medical monitors were incorporated into art displays, and treatment schedules were adjusted to optimize patients' energy levels for the celebration. James found himself in the middle of it all, his expensive suits replaced by more practical attire as he helped move furniture and hang decorations. The corporate world that had once consumed his entire existence now seemed distant compared to the immediate reality of preparing for this celebration. Victoria's increasingly urgent messages about shareholder concerns went unanswered as he focused on making sure every detail honored Liam's vision. Security posed unique challenges. The hospital's head of security worked to balance safety protocols with the need for an unwelcoming atmosphere. Children contributed ideas here: 2 guest badges designed to look like superhero identifiers, security checkpoints transformed into magical gateways. Each solution reflected the careful marriage of practical necessity with the imagination that made the pediatric ward special. The media circus outside grew as the event approached, but inside a different kind of magic was taking shape. Families who had been strangers weeks ago now worked together, sharing stories and support as they prepared for the celebration. The ward's usual rhythms of treatments and tests continued, but now they were punctuated by bursts of creative energy and shared purpose. Parents noticed changes in their children. The upcoming event gave them something to focus on beyond their illnesses. Even those too sick to participate fully found ways to contribute, offering ideas, creating artwork, or simply sharing their excitement. The hospital's child life specialists reported improved morale and engagement across all age groups. One particular project captured everyone's imagination: a massive collaborative art piece based on Liam's unfinished Thanksgiving drawing. Each patient added their own interpretation of gratitude, creating a sprawling mural that would serve as the celebration's centerpiece. Sarah spent hours helping children contribute their visions, her quiet guidance helping them express hopes and fears through art, just as Liam had done. The night before the event, James stood alone on the rooftop, taking in the transformation. Fairy lights reflected off the city's glass towers, creating a magical atmosphere that matched Liam's artistic vision. A gentle breeze stirred the decorations, making the paper turkeys dance. In the distance, he could see his corporate office, the empire he'd built, but for the first time in his adult life, it didn't feel like the most important thing in his world. Behind him, he heard the door open. Sarah Morgan stepped out, carrying a final decoration, a framed copy of Liam's original drawing. Together, they found the perfect spot for it, where it would greet guests as they arrived. Neither spoke, but both understood that tomorrow would be more than just an event. It would be the realization of a child's last, greatest wish to bring people together in gratitude. Victoria Whitman stormed into the hospital rooftop garden on Thanksgiving morning, her Louboutin heels clicking against the floor with military precision. Behind her, a team of lawyers and PR specialists hovered nervously, clutching tablets and legal documents. The early morning preparations halted as she confronted James among the half-finished decorations. "The board has called an emergency session," she announced, her voice tight with controlled fury. "They're voting to remove you as CEO. This has gone far enough, James. You're destroying everything we've built." She thrust a stack of papers toward him: shareholder complaints, media analyses, risk assessments. 3 major investors have threatened to pull out. Our stock has dropped 15%. James continued hanging fairy lights with Emma, who watched the scene unfold with the shrewd assessment of a child who'd seen too many adult conflicts in hospital rooms. "The lights need to be perfect," he replied calmly. "Emma here has calculated the exact spacing to match the constellations." Victoria's composure cracked. "This isn't about lights. This is about our family's legacy. Dad built this company from nothing, and you're turning it into a circus because one child's letter made you feel guilty. What about the thousands of employees who depend on us? What about our responsibility to shareholders?" The confrontation drew attention. Parents setting up tables paused their work. Nurse Mike stepped closer, his protective instincts extending beyond just his patients. Dr. Thompson emerged from a planning meeting, watching carefully from the doorway. "Our father James," said quietly, finally turning to face his sister, "used to say that wealth without purpose was poverty in disguise. Remember that? Or were you too busy calculating ROI on his funeral arrangements to notice?" The words hit hard. Their father's memorial service had indeed been a masterclass in corporate efficiency. Victoria recoiled as if struck. "That's not fair. I've worked just as hard as you to honor his memory. Everything I've done has been to protect this family, this company. We help people through proper channels, with proper procedures. This emotional chaos isn't helping anyone." Sarah Morgan chose that moment to arrive, carrying Liam's original sketchbook. She stopped short at the scene, but something in Victoria's expression made her step forward. Without a word, she opened the book to the unfinished Thanksgiving drawing and held it out to Victoria. "He drew this the day before he died," Sarah said softly. "Look closely at the empty chairs. He labeled them. There's one for you too, MS Whitman. He said everyone should have a place at the table of gratitude, especially people who forgot how to be grateful." Victoria's hands trembled as she took the sketchbook. For the first time, she really looked at the drawing, the careful details, the hopeful empty chairs, the love poured into every line. She saw her name there, written in a child's unsteady hand, next to a chair waiting to be filled. "I can't," her voice broke. "I can't do this. I can't watch you throw everything away. The board meeting is at noon. If you don't show up with a plan to normalize operations, they'll vote you out. I won't be able to stop them." She turned to leave, but James caught her arm. "Stay," he said simply. "Not as a Whitman executive. Not as my sister, the PR expert. Just stay as Victoria, who used to sneak extra pudding cups to sick kids when Mom was in the hospital. Remember her? The silence stretched between them, heavy with decades of chosen distance and corporate armor. Finally, Victoria looked around at the children, watching with solemn understanding, at the parents who saw their own family struggles reflected, at the staff who dealt with life and death while they argued about stock prices. The board meeting she started weekly. "We'll have to proceed without us," James finished. "There's a paper turkey that needs more thankful thoughts written on its feathers. Emma says the purple glitter pen works best." Television crews clustered outside Manhattan Memorial Hospital as Thanksgiving Day unfolded, their satellite trucks creating a media village that stretched around the block. Social media erupted with dueling hashtags. Whitman cares and corporatist battled for trending supremacy. The morning news shows buzzed with speculation about James Whitman's apparent corporate suicide and the deeper implications for corporate philanthropy. CNBC ran a split screen on one side, the Whitman Enterprises board meeting where executives voted on James's future on the other, live footage of children's artwork being carried to the hospital roof. The contrast couldn't have been starker: suits and spreadsheets versus hand-painted turkeys and fairy lights. Financial analysts debated the impact on shareholder value while medical ethicists discussed the human value of personal engagement in healthcare. Inside the hospital, patients and families rallied around their own narrative. Emma, between rounds of hanging decorations, gave an impromptu interview to a nurse's cell phone camera. "Mr. Whitman learned all our names," she declared proudly. "He even knows which pudding flavors everyone likes." The video, posted without corporate approval, went viral within hours, spawning hundreds of response videos from other hospitals sharing their own stories of human connection versus corporate distance. The Washington Post ran a feature comparing Liam's thank you letter to the standard corporate responses to patient gratitude. They published the internal memo about Robert Morgan's incident management alongside Sarah's quiet testimonial about James's transformation. The stark difference between corporate protocol and human empathy sparked fierce online debates about the role of wealth in healthcare. Victoria's carefully crafted PR statements collided with reality when hospital staff began sharing their experiences. Nurse Mike's description of James learning to change IV bags and sitting with worried parents overnight painted a picture that no corporate crisis management could control. Dr. Thompson's medical journal blog about the therapeutic value of community and connection went viral in healthcare circles. Former patients from Manhattan Memorial started speaking out. They shared stories of isolation, of feeling like statistics rather than people. Then they contrasted these with recent experiences: James reading stories during chemotherapy sessions, helping with homework, learning each child's favorite songs. The narrative shifted from corporate philanthropy to human connection. The board meeting's live stream showed grim-faced executives discussing liability and brand damage. Meanwhile, social media filled with images of the hospital's transformation: fairy lights and paper turkeys, art projects and smile-filled faces. Each corporate argument about professional distance was met with evidence of the healing power of personal engagement. Local news interviewed hospital staff who'd worked there during Robert Morgan's time. They remembered him as more than a chauffeur. He was the man who brought books to night shift nurses, who knew every security guard's children's names, who kept an extra umbrella in his car for visitors caught in the rain. These stories transformed the narrative from corporate crisis to personal redemption. Medical professionals nationwide began sharing their own experiences with corporate healthcare. Stories poured in about the gap between institutional charity and actual human needs. The debate expanded beyond Whitman Enterprises to question the entire system of corporate involvement in healthcare. Sarah Morgan's quiet dignity became a powerful counterpoint to corporate messaging. When asked by reporters about the controversy, she simply showed them Liam's artwork. "My son saw the best in people," she would say. Sometimes it just takes time for that best to find its way out. Her words, free from bitterness or blame, carried more weight than any press release. By afternoon, the narrative had shifted decisively. What began as a story about corporate rebellion became one about human connection and the real meaning of care. Even business publications struggled to maintain their focus on shareholder value as images of the hospital celebration preparation dominated social media. As Thanksgiving dinner approached, public opinion crystallized around a simple truth: sometimes the most valuable corporate assets aren't found on any balance sheet. They're found in the moments of human connection that transform institutions into communities, patients into people, and corporate charity into genuine care. As twilight descended on Manhattan Memorial's rooftop garden, the first guests began arriving for the Thanksgiving celebration. Children in wheelchairs, trailing IV poles transformed into twinkling light stands, emerged from elevators decorated with paper turkeys. Parents who'd spent countless hours in hospital chairs now found themselves guided to tables adorned with their children's artwork. The board's decision to remove James as CEO had come through an hour earlier, but in the growing magic of the evening, corporate politics seemed to belong to another world entirely. James stood at the entrance, helping Emma adjust her fairy princess crown as she took her self-appointed role as official greeter seriously. Together they welcomed each family with the same warmth, whether they arrived in worn sneakers or designer boots. Dr. Thompson orchestrated a complex dance of medical care disguised as festive activities. Nurse Mike, wearing a turkey-shaped hat that made children giggle, smoothly incorporated necessary treatments into the celebration's flow. The medical staff moved through the crowd with practiced ease, ensuring that no clinical necessity interrupted the evening's spirit. Victoria arrived just as the sun set, her corporate armor softened by uncertainty. She stood at the edge of the gathering, watching her brother help a young boy in a wheelchair navigate the buffet line. Sarah Morgan approached her quietly, offering a paper turkey feather and a purple glitter pen. "Everyone adds their gratitude," she explained. Liam started the tradition. The food reflected the hospital's diverse community: traditional turkey alongside special preparations for various dietary needs, each dish labeled with a child's drawing explaining its significance. The head chef beamed as children who'd struggled with appetite for months found joy in the carefully adapted offerings. Even hospital food, it seemed, could become magical with enough love and creativity. Media crews attempting to film from adjacent buildings captured something they hadn't expected: not a corporate PR event, but a genuine celebration of life, hope, and connection. But through their Zoom lenses, they saw James Whitman, newly ousted CEO, serving pie to patients, his designer suit now spotted with glitter and gravy. They watched Victoria gradually drawn into a child's card game, her professional reserve melting as she learned the special rules invented by young experts in passing time. The evening centerpiece was unveiled: the collaborative artwork based on Liam's unfinished drawing. Each patient had added their own vision of gratitude, creating a sprawling mural of hope and healing. Sarah stood before it, surrounded by families who'd known Liam and those who'd only known his story, as she shared his simple philosophy: thankfulness grows when we share it. A small crisis emerged when one child's medication schedule threatened to pull them away from the celebration. Instead of whisking them off to a treatment room, the medical team transformed the necessary procedure into part of the festivities. Other children gathered around, sharing stories and jokes, turning a moment of medical necessity into one of community support. As night fell completely, the fairy lights twinkled against the city skyline. Children who'd been strangers weeks ago now moved between tables like longtime friends, sharing turkey-shaped cookies and trading hand-drawn cards. Parents who'd once only nodded to each other in hallways now embraced, sharing both tears and laughter. James found himself at a table with Emma, Victoria, and Sarah, watching as the celebration he'd risked everything for unfolded around them. Emma was explaining the constellations visible through the tent's clear panels. Her knowledge gleaned from nights spent stargazing through hospital windows. Victoria, still wearing her boardroom attire but now decorated with children's stickers, listened with genuine interest. A young patient's voice rose above the gentle buzz of conversation. "Can we do this again next year?" The question hung in the air, heavy with hope and possibility. James, no longer a CEO but somehow richer than he'd ever been, caught Sarah's eye across the table. She smiled and pulled out Liam's sketchbook, opening it to the unfinished drawing that had started it all. The Thanksgiving celebration was in full swing when Dr. Thompson's pager buzzed urgently. Tommy, a 10-year-old leukemia patient who had been doing well enough to join the festivities, had suddenly collapsed near the dessert table. The medical team's response was immediate but subtle, years of experience allowing them to move with urgency while maintaining calm. James, who had been helping Tommy select a slice of pumpkin pie moments before, found himself holding the boy's hand as Dr. Thompson assessed his condition. The child's face, painted with a turkey design by one of the art therapy volunteers just hours earlier, had gone frighteningly pale. His mother, a single parent who worked 2 jobs to manage the medical bills, arrived at his side, her festive sweater now stained with spilled cranberry sauce from their interrupted dinner. "His numbers were stable this morning," Nurse Mike murmured to Dr. Thompson, already preparing emergency medications with practiced efficiency. The other children watched with the solemn understanding that comes from too much experience with medical crises, while their parents instinctively moved to shield them from the scene. Victoria, who had been learning origami from a young patient nearby, surprised everyone by taking charge of crowd management. With unexpected gentleness, she began organizing activities in another section of the rooftop, drawing attention away from the emergency while ensuring the celebration could continue for others. Sarah Morgan stepped in as well, her experience with hospital emergencies evident in her calm demeanor. She sat with Tommy's mother, holding her hand while medical terms flew back and forth over their heads. He was so excited about the party, his mother whispered, clutching the paper turkey he'd decorated. He said it was worth feeling tired for. The city lights twinkled beyond the rooftop garden, oblivious to the drama unfolding beneath them. Emma, still wearing her fairy princess crown, quietly collected Tommy's art projects from the display wall, carefully preserving them for his return. Her own experience with sudden setbacks reflected in her careful movements. James found himself in a familiar position of wanting to fix things with money, but feeling helplessly inadequate in the face of medical reality. The corporate board meeting that had stripped him of his CEO title seemed trivial now, watching Tommy fight for breath while his mother whispered prayers. Dr. Thompson worked with focused intensity, her earlier festive mood replaced by professional concentration. "We need to move him downstairs," she finally announced. As they prepared to transfer Tommy to intensive care, his small hand gripped James's sleeve. "Don't let them clean up my spot," Tommy whispered. "I still have to write what I'm thankful for on my turkey feather." His words, brave despite his condition, struck everyone within earshot. His mother stifled a sob as the medical team began moving his stretcher toward the elevator. The celebration continued, subdued but determined, just as life in the pediatric ward always continued through crises. Children who understood all too well what was happening added extra thankful thoughts to Tommy's turkey, making sure his presence remained part of the gathering. James stayed with Tommy's mother through the initial tests, learning for the first time what it truly meant to be present for someone in crisis. Not as a CEO, not as a donor, but simply as a human being sharing another's fear and hope. In the sterile brightness of the intensive care unit, far from the twinkling lights of the rooftop celebration, James Whitman finally broke. The careful walls he'd built over decades of corporate success crumbled as he watched Tommy's mother fill out yet another round of insurance forms with trembling hands. The media crews that had followed him from the rooftop caught the moment he emerged from the ICU. His designer shirt was rumpled, face streaked with tears he couldn't contain. When a reporter thrust a microphone forward, asking about the board's decision to remove him as CEO, something inside him snapped. "You want a story?" His voice cracked with emotion. "Here's your story. Right now, a 10-year-old boy is fighting for his life because our healthcare system is built on spreadsheets instead of compassion. His mother is choosing between paying rent and buying medications, and until 3 weeks ago, I was part of the problem. Victoria appeared at his side, attempting to manage the situation, but James continued, his words tumbling out with raw honesty. I spent years signing charitable donations to hospitals without ever walking through their doors. I processed a faithful employee's death like a quarterly report. I built an empire on the premise of helping people while keeping them at arm's length. The cameras rolled as he pulled out Liam's sketchbook, holding it up for all to see. A dying child thanked me for my help, and I couldn't even be bothered to read his letter until it was too late. Do you want to know what corporate efficiency looks like? It looks like a father dying in your company car while his son draws pictures in a hospital bed, grateful for the very system that failed his family. Hospital security moved to create a barrier between James and the press, but he waved them off. His breakdown had drawn an audience: hospital staff, patients' families, even some board members who had come to assess the situation. They watched as their former CEO, known for his unshakable composure, laid bare the cost of corporate detachment. I lost my company today, he continued, his voice steadying. But up there, he pointed to the rooftop, children are celebrating life despite everything. They're teaching us about gratitude while fighting battles we can't imagine. They're completing a drawing that a boy named Liam started, showing us what really matters. Sarah Morgan stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on his arm. The touch seemed to both break and steady him. We're supposed to be the ones with answers, he said more quietly now. With the successful ones, the leaders. But we've forgotten the most basic truth that every number on our spreadsheets is a human story. Victoria, who had been frantically trying to control the narrative, suddenly stopped. She looked at her brother, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. The corporate mask she'd worn for so long slipped as she remembered their own mother's hospital stays, the fear and helplessness they'd sworn never to feel again. The cameras captured it all: James Whitman's public transformation from corporate titan to broken, honest human being. But they also caught something else: the way hospital staff nodded in understanding, the way families reached out to offer support, the way his vulnerability created a bridge between the worlds of corporate power and human need. In the quiet corridor outside Tommy's ICU room, Sarah Morgan finally confronted James Whitman. The celebration continued above them on the rooftop, but here in the fluorescent-lit hallway, raw truth demanded its moment. You know what Liam said the night before he died? Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she clutched her son's sketchbook. He said he was worried about you. Not about dying, not about leaving me alone, but about you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken grief. James, still reeling from his public breakdown, leaned against the wall. His tie hung loose, his carefully cultivated image of corporate perfection completely undone. Why would he worry about me? He asked softly, genuinely confused. Because, Sarah continued, opening the sketchbook to a page James hadn't seen before, he said you had the hardest job of all, trying to help everyone without letting yourself feel anything. The drawing showed the Whitman Tower, but instead of its usual imposing presence, it appeared as a lonely castle with a single figure at the top. 3 years ago, when Robert died, you sent flowers and a check. Her voice cracked slightly. Did you know he kept a photo of you and him in his wallet? From that Christmas party where you actually stopped to talk to him about his family. He said it was the one time you seemed real. The memory hit James like a physical blow. He remembered that brief conversation, how he'd quickly retreated when he felt himself becoming too personally invested. How many such moments had he cut short over the years? Liam spent his last weeks trying to finish that Thanksgiving drawing. Sarah continued, her composure finally breaking. Not because he wanted to guilt you, but because he believed everyone deserves a place at the table, even people who've forgotten how to sit with others. Hospital staff moved quietly around them, respecting the intensity of the moment while maintaining their duties. Through the ICU window, they could see Tommy's mother singing softly to her son, another parent facing the unimaginable with quiet courage. "I was so angry at you," Sarah admitted. "Not just for Robert, but for all the times you could have seen us as people instead of statistics." "But Liam," she paused, wiping tears. Liam said anger takes too much energy, and he needed his energy for drawing hope. James slid down the wall until he sat on the cold hospital floor, protocol forgotten. Sarah joined him, their shoulders nearly touching as they looked at Liam's artwork together. "He drew you into every celebration picture, you know," she said softly. "Always with an empty chair beside you, always with space to join in." Through the window, they watched Tommy's monitors blink steadily, each beep a reminder of life's fragility and preciousness. "I don't know how to do this," James confessed. "I don't know how to feel everything and still function." Sarah closed the sketchbook gently. "That's what Liam worried about. He said sometimes the richest people are the poorest at being human." She stood, straightening her simple dress. "But he believed you could learn. That's why he drew all those empty chairs, not to show what was missing, but to show what could be." Victoria Whitman stood in the hospital's administrative offices, her composure regained after witnessing her brother's breakdown. Before her lay the paperwork that could end this entire emotional experiment. As she called it, regulatory complaints, liability concerns, and health code violations she'd carefully documented over the past weeks. "The celebration needs to end now," she informed the hospital administrator, her voice carrying the weight of corporate authority. "The liability risks are unacceptable. One child has already been rushed to ICU. We can't risk any more incidents." She pushed forward a preliminary injunction from the board's legal team. Dr. Thompson, who had just returned from checking on Tommy, entered the office mid-conversation. "And what about the risk to our patients' spirits?" she challenged. "Have you calculated that on your spreadsheets, Ms. Whitman? The cost of stealing hope from children who have precious little to begin with?" Victoria faltered momentarily, remembering Emma's delighted explanation of constellation patterns earlier that evening. She shook off the memory, steeling herself. This isn't about emotions. It's about protecting the hospital, the company, everyone involved. But as she moved to present more documentation, Sarah Morgan appeared in the doorway, still holding Liam's sketchbook. Without a word, she opened it to a page Victoria hadn't seen: a drawing of herself, sketched from newspaper photos, but transformed. In Liam's vision, she was smiling, surrounded by children, her corporate armor replaced by warmth. "He drew this the week before he died," Sarah explained quietly. "He said you looked sad in all your press photos, like someone who'd forgotten how to play the simple observation, coming from a child who'd never met her, struck deeper than any corporate argument." Victoria's hands trembled as she looked at the drawing. She saw herself as Liam had imagined her could be, not the ruthless corporate protector she'd become, but someone capable of joy, of connection. Behind her, the sound of children's laughter drifted down from the rooftop celebration. Dr. Thompson seized the moment. "Come see what you're trying to stop," she suggested, leading Victoria to the pediatric ward's playroom. There, displayed on every wall, were photos of the evening celebrations, children forgetting their pain in moments of joy, parents sharing genuine smiles, even hardened medical staff softening in the glow of authentic human connection. "Your brother didn't break the system," Dr. Thompson continued. "He remembered its purpose. These aren't liability risks, they're humans in need of more than just medical treatment." Victoria stood silent, her carefully prepared arguments crumbling. Through the window, she could see James sitting with Tommy's mother in the ICU, offering the kind of support no corporate policy could prescribe. The sight of her always controlled brother openly sharing another's pain shifted something fundamental in her understanding. Slowly, deliberately, Victoria gathered her legal documents. The hospital administrator and Dr. Thompson watched tensely as she stood, straightening her designer suit. Then, to everyone's surprise, she tore the papers in half. "The board won't like this," she said quietly, "but Liam's drawing, He saw something in me I'd forgotten existed. She turned to Sarah. Would you? Would you show me more of his artwork? I think I need to understand what he understood. In the quiet aftermath of Victoria's decision, James found himself drawn to the hospital's storage room. Among the carefully labeled boxes of unclaimed belongings, he discovered one marked Morgan R. Personal Effects. The box had sat there for 3 years, its contents deemed too insignificant for corporate attention. With trembling hands, he opened it. Robert Morgan's possessions told the story of a life lived in careful dedication, a worn logbook recording every drive, maintenance schedule, and passenger preference, a small collection of thank you notes from passengers who'd appreciated his kindness, photographs of Liam at various ages, some taken in front of the Whitman Tower. At the bottom of the box lay a leather-bound journal. The final entry, dated the day before the accident, read, Mr. Whitman seemed troubled today. Drove him to 3 meetings about hospital funding. He's trying to help people. But I wonder if he remembers what it feels like to actually connect with them. Liam says I should invite him to dinner sometime. Everyone needs a family, he says. Maybe next week, when things are less busy. Tucked between the journal's pages, James found a carefully preserved drawing, Liam's first artwork of the Whitman Tower. Below it, in Robert's neat handwriting, my son sees beauty everywhere, even in places where others only see power. Mr. Whitman built this tower to help people, but Liam draws it as a lighthouse, guiding people home. The discovery struck James with the weight of missed opportunities. Here was evidence of a life that had intersected with his own every day, yet he'd never truly seen it. Robert hadn't just been a chauffeur, he'd been an observer, a chronicler of humanity in the corporate world, a father who taught his son to find hope in steel and glass. Sarah found him there, surrounded by Robert's belongings. Together they read through the logbook entries, small notations about James's habits, preferences, and rare moments of unguarded humanity. Robert had noticed everything: when James seemed stressed, when he needed quiet, even the one time he'd almost asked about Liam's drawings displayed in the car. Among the papers, they discovered an unfinished letter addressed to James, dated the morning of the accident. Thank you for the opportunity to serve not just as a driver, but as a witness to good works in progress. Liam says everyone needs reminding sometimes that they're making a difference. Maybe that's what I'm really doing here, not just driving, but believing in the purpose behind each journey. In Tommy's ICU room, while waiting for test results, Sarah pulled a small, worn notebook from her bag, Liam's private journal, which he'd never shared before. He made me promise to give this to you if you ever started to understand, she said softly, handing it to James. The journal's pages revealed a child's extraordinary perspective on life in the hospital. Unlike his public artwork, these entries exposed raw honesty about fear, pain, and an almost supernatural understanding of the adults around him. Most striking were his observations about James, drawn from stories his father had shared and newspaper clippings he'd collected. Dad says Mr. Whitman helps so many people but never smiles in photos, one entry read. Maybe it's hard to smile when you're carrying everyone's hopes. I'm going to draw him smiling in all my pictures so he can see what it looks like. Another page held a carefully preserved hospital receipt with James's signature authorizing funding for experimental treatments. Beside it, Liam had written, Mom cried today because we can stay for more treatment. She thinks Mr. Whitman just signs papers, but I think he's fighting dragons for us, the kind you can't see but hurt people anyway. The most revealing entry came from his final week. The nurses say I don't have much time left, but that's okay. I finished most of my drawings. The only one I can't finish is the Thanksgiving one. But maybe that's right. Dad always said sometimes you have to leave space for others to add their own story. I hope Mr. Whitman finds his story to add. Interspersed throughout were small sketches the hospital transformed into a castle, doctors and nurses depicted as knights and wizards, IV poles reimagined as magical staffs. But most poignant were the drawings of James himself, each one showing him not as he was, but as Liam believed he could be, surrounded by children, sharing meals with families, part of the human story he'd helped create. The final entry, written in shaky handwriting. Red Dad used to say everyone has two stories, the one they show and the one they're afraid to tell. I think Mr. Whitman's real story is beautiful. Even if he doesn't know it yet. Maybe someday he'll let people see it. I'm leaving him an empty chair in my drawing, just in case. In the quiet of the hospital chapel, James and Victoria sat together examining Liam's unfinished Thanksgiving drawing under the gentle stained glass light. Sarah had brought them the original version, larger and more detailed than the copy they'd been working from. As they studied it closely, previously unseen details emerged. Every empty chair at the vast table bore a tiny inscription. One was labeled for the doctor who thinks she failed, clearly meant for Dr. Thompson, who'd blamed herself for being unable to save more patients. Another read for the nurse who dances to make children laugh, Nurse Mike's special place. The chair marked for James carried a longer note for the man who fights dragons with paper shields. But it was Victoria's designated seat that revealed the drawing's deeper purpose. Her chair bore the words for the lady who guards the castle, in case she remembers it's really a lighthouse. Next to it was a small sketch of the Whitman Tower, but drawn as a beacon rather than a corporate fortress, its lights reaching out to guide people home. The table itself told a story, empty plates waiting to be filled, spaces left deliberately incomplete, each blank area an invitation for someone to add their own contribution. Liam had turned the entire concept of a finished artwork on its head. The empty spaces weren't omissions but opportunities. Around the table's edges, barely visible, were faint pencil marks showing other tables extending beyond the page's boundaries. Liam had deliberately drawn it to suggest endlessness, a celebration without limits that could grow to include anyone who needed a place to belong. The most revealing detail appeared in the drawing's corner, a small key explaining the symbolism. Empty chairs, empty hearts waiting to be filled. Blank spaces, room for new stories. Unfinished food treats yet to be shared. Table with no ends, family that keeps growing. Sarah pointed to a faded eraser mark in the center, where Liam had clearly removed something only to leave it blank. He said that space was special, she explained. It's where people would put their pride down and pick up their humanity instead. He worked on it for days before deciding it needed to stay empty, a reminder that sometimes the most important things can't be drawn. The unfinished nature of the drawing wasn't a result of Liam running out of time, it was his final message about the endless possibility of human connection. Each incomplete element was an invitation to continue the work he'd started, not just on paper, but in reality. Victoria stood at Tommy's ICU window, watching her brother holding the boy's hand while doctors administered treatment. Her designer suit felt like armor now, heavy and out of place among the honest emotions surrounding her. In her hands, she held the latest board resolution demanding an immediate end to all unauthorized charitable activities. The corporate language she'd crafted so carefully over the years suddenly seemed hollow. Words like liability mitigation and brand protection couldn't capture the reality before her, a child fighting for life while a community rallied around him, their abandoned Thanksgiving celebrations still twinkling hopefully on the rooftop above. A nurse approached, offering her a child's drawing, one of Tommy's latest works, created just hours before his collapse. It showed the Whitman Tower, but not as the imposing corporate headquarters she knew. Instead, it depicted the building with open doors and windows filled with smiling faces, golden light spilling out to welcome everyone inside. He said it's how the building looks in his dreams, the nurse explained, where business suits turn into superhero capes and board meetings are about planning parties for sick kids. The simple interpretation of their family legacy struck Victoria with unexpected force. She thought of all the press releases she'd written, carefully crafting the image of Whitman Enterprises as a benevolent corporate giant. But here was the truth drawn in crayon by children who saw past corporate facades to the potential beneath. Liam had seen it. Tommy saw it. Perhaps it was time she saw it too. Pulling out her phone, Victoria began composing a new message to the board. Not a press release this time, but a resignation letter. "I've spent years protecting a legacy I didn't fully understand," she wrote. "Today, I watched my brother lose his company but find his purpose. It's time for me to find mine." She added one final line, quoting from Liam's journal, "Sometimes the strongest walls aren't the ones we build around our buildings, but the ones we tear down around our hearts." Then she removed her corporate ID badge, placing it beside Tommy's drawing. A faint sound of singing drifted down from the rooftop, where the celebration continued in quiet solidarity with their missing friend. Victoria found herself humming along, remembering how her mother used to sing during her own hospital stays, another memory she'd locked away in her pursuit of corporate perfection. Tommy's condition stabilized just before midnight, his vital signs strengthening as Thanksgiving drew to a close. The relief that flooded the ICU touched everyone who had held vigil: doctors, nurses, James, Victoria, and most importantly, his exhausted mother. In that moment of collective exhale, something shifted in the hospital's atmosphere. Victoria, who had spent the evening making calls and arrangements of a different kind than her usual corporate dealings, approached Sarah Morgan. Their eyes met in the fluorescent-lit hallway, years of unspoken history hanging between them. "I found this in Robert's old files," Victoria said softly, holding out a photograph. It showed Robert and Liam at a company Christmas party, both beaming at the camera. In the background, barely noticeable, stood Victoria herself, half smiling at something Liam had said. "I didn't remember this moment until now. He made everyone laugh that night, even me." Sarah took the photo gently, her fingers tracing the familiar faces. Liam kept talking about that party for weeks. He said it was the first time he saw angels in business suits. She smiled at the memory. "He meant you and James. He thought you were both so powerful you must be angels in disguise, trying to help people." James joined them, still wearing the paper crown Emma had insisted he keep. "We weren't angels," he said quietly. "We were just people who forgot how to be human." He reached for Victoria's hand, a gesture they hadn't shared since childhood. "But maybe it's not too late to remember." The siblings, once united only by corporate ambition, found themselves sharing tears for the first time since their mother's illness. Victoria's carefully maintained makeup smudged as she leaned into her brother's embrace, while Sarah watched the corporate armor finally crumble completely. Dr. Thompson appeared with coffee for everyone, her doctor's coat now decorated with children's stickers from the celebration. "Tommy's asking for his art supplies," she announced with a tired smile, "and he wants to know if his spot at the table is still saved." The simple question, so full of hope and resilience, broke the last barriers between them. Victoria wiped her eyes, smudging her mascara further. "Tell him I've been keeping his chair warm," she said. "And maybe he can teach me how to draw angels in business suits." The sun began to rise over Manhattan, painting the hospital windows in gentle gold. A new day was beginning, carrying with it the promise of healing, not just for the patients, but for all those who had found their way back to humanity through a child's wisdom and an unfinished drawing. 1 month after the Thanksgiving celebration, James and Victoria stood in Liam's former hospital room, now transformed into the headquarters of the newly established Liam Morgan Foundation. The walls, once stark and clinical, now showcased children's artwork from across the hospital network, each piece telling its own story of hope and healing. The Foundation's mission statement, written in both formal text and children's crayon, declared its purpose to bridge the gap between corporate giving and human connection. Below it hung Liam's unfinished Thanksgiving drawing, now framed not as an incomplete work but as an ongoing invitation for others to join the story. Sarah Morgan had accepted the position of Foundation Director, her understanding of both hospital needs and human hearts making her the perfect choice. Her first initiative was the Empty Chair program, ensuring that every child's treatment included not just medical care, but also opportunities for creative expression and community connection. The boardroom that had once hosted corporate strategists now welcomed a different kind of meeting. Doctors shared space with patients' families, hospital administrators sat alongside child life specialists, and corporate donors found themselves learning from the children they helped. Each meeting began with art therapy and ended with shared meals, breaking down barriers between giving and receiving. Victoria, surprisingly, proved instrumental in reshaping corporate philanthropy. Her experience in navigating business worlds made her the perfect translator between institutional donors and human needs. She started a mentorship program pairing executives with hospital families, teaching empathy through direct connection rather than distant donation. The Foundation's first major project was implementing Liam's libraries in pediatric wards across the city. Each space combined medical resource centers with creative studios, where children could both understand their conditions and express their experiences through art. The walls featured rotating galleries of patient artwork, ensuring that every child's voice had a chance to be heard. James, no longer a CEO but now something far more valuable, spent his days moving between hospital rooms and foundation offices. He learned every patient's name, their favorite colors, their dreams beyond survival. His former business acumen found new purpose in creating sustainable ways to humanize healthcare. The Foundation's logo, designed by Tommy during his recovery, showed the Whitman Tower transformed into a lighthouse, its beams reaching out to guide others home. Below it, in children's handwriting, was the motto Liam had written in his journal: "Every empty chair is a space waiting for love to fill it." 1 year after the Thanksgiving that changed everything, Manhattan Memorial Hospital had become a model for humanized healthcare across the country. The changes weren't just cosmetic, they ran deep into the institution's culture, transforming how care was delivered and received. Every morning began with Liam's Hour, where patients, families, and staff gathered to share artwork and stories. The hospital's once sterile corridors now featured interactive art installations where children could add their own touches. Even the medical equipment had been reimagined. IV poles wore superhero capes, scanning machines bore friendly faces, and treatment rooms featured ceiling murals designed by patients. The impact rippled beyond the hospital walls. Other healthcare institutions began sending representatives to study the Manhattan Memorial model. They witnessed treatment plans that included not just medical protocols but also creative expression and community support. Insurance companies, initially skeptical, found that patients in humanized care environments showed improved recovery rates. Medical students rotating through the hospital learned more than just procedures. They attended art therapy sessions alongside their patients, wrote in gratitude journals, and participated in weekly community meals. The next generation of doctors was learning that healing involved more than just medicine. Corporate donors, inspired by the Whitman siblings' transformation, began changing their approach to philanthropy. Board members who had once opposed James's emotional experiment now volunteered regularly, their own perspectives transformed by direct engagement with the families they helped. Several major companies launched similar programs, creating a network of humanized healthcare initiatives across the city. The Empty Chair program expanded to include regular community celebrations, each one adding new stories to Liam's legacy. Former patients returned as volunteers, their own experiences helping guide others through difficult journeys. The hospital's rooftop garden, site of that first Thanksgiving gathering, became a permanent celebration space where healing and hope intertwined. Perhaps most significantly, the hospital's statistics showed measurable improvements. Patient satisfaction scores soared, staff retention increased, and even recovery rates showed positive trends. The data proved what Liam had somehow known, that healing happens best in an environment of connection and creativity. Sarah Morgan's daily rounds now included not just checking on patients but also ensuring that each child had opportunities to contribute their voice to the hospital's ongoing story. The Foundation's art therapy programs had waiting lists of volunteers, many of them business executives seeking to understand healthcare from the human side. On the anniversary of that transformative Thanksgiving, the rooftop garden of Manhattan Memorial hosted another celebration. Tommy, now fully recovered, stood proudly beside his latest artwork, a massive mural that completed Liam's unfinished drawing. The empty chairs were now filled with painted portraits of the hospital community, each face telling its own story of healing and hope. James and Victoria Whitman, no longer bound by corporate titles, moved through the crowd with easy familiarity. James wore one of Emma's handmade badges, declaring him official story listener, while Victoria's designer suit was accessorized with children's artwork pins. They had found their true legacy not in building towers, but in breaking down walls. Sarah Morgan, watching from beside Liam's original drawing, saw her son's vision fully realized. The celebration had expanded beyond the hospital, drawing together patients, families, medical staff, and community members in a tapestry of connection. The Foundation's work had spread to hospitals across the country, each adapting Liam's philosophy to their own communities. Dr. Thompson shared quiet tears with Nurse Mike as they remembered that first chaotic Thanksgiving. They now led seminars on humanized healthcare, teaching other medical professionals how to balance clinical excellence with human connection. Their methods had become part of medical school curricula, ensuring future generations of healthcare providers would understand the power of treating patients as people first. As evening fell, the fairy lights twinkled against the city skyline, matching the stars that Emma still loved to map. The hospital board chairman, who had once voted to remove James as CEO, stood to make an announcement. Manhattan Memorial would be renamed the Liam Morgan Memorial Hospital, ensuring that the wisdom of a child would continue guiding their mission. The gathering ended with a new tradition, each person adding their own brushstroke to a community painting, creating something beautiful from their collective experience. In the corner, barely visible unless you knew where to look, hung Robert Morgan's old photograph of the Whitman Tower. Beside it, Tommy's drawing showed the same building transformed into a lighthouse, its beams reaching out to guide others home. James found himself back at the spot where he'd first read Liam's letter. The city spread out below, its lights mirroring the stars above, while behind him the sounds of celebration created a symphony of life and hope. He realized that sometimes the greatest journeys weren't about reaching the top of towers, but about finding your way back to humanity. Thank you for sharing this journey with us. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and help us continue sharing meaningful narratives. Share this video with friends and family who might find comfort or inspiration in these words. Your likes and thoughtful comments not only support our team but create a community where stories of hope and human connection can flourish. Let us know in the comments below how this story resonated with you. Every emotion, every reflection matters. Together, we can keep spreading stories that remind us of our shared humanity.